directed personally, and Robert made a similar comment, and I apologise to you also, Robert. The point there that I was trying to make was to identify a group which is utilised by the media. Having said that, I think that in order to genuinely engage with some of the comments that have been made, we need to be presented with objective evidence for a couple of the statements that have been made by both Robert and Daniel, and also we need points of clarification. Now, Robert and Daniel have both said that there are aspects of Islamic law which make non-Muslim citizens of a Muslim state lesser. Well, can they give one example that applies to either Christians or Jews or both, so that I actually have something to engage with? Secondly, Daniel suggested that Osama bin Laden is very popular and that many children have been named after him. Well, again, I'd need some sort of objective evidence for that, otherwise that's just a statement. Now, Robert also asked a question earlier about where are all the Muslims that are renouncing terrorism? Well, they're everywhere and they're very public. And indeed in the United States, I mean, one very prominent Muslim immediately comes to mind, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hanson, who is popular not only in the Western world but also in the Islamic world, but considered to be authoritative by basically all Muslims, and who not only publicly renounced the September 11 attacks, not only has consistently publicly renounced the consistent violence in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, but he was actually even utilised by former President George W. Bush as an advisor on Islamic issues. So, and this is somebody that's respected worldwide and has millions of followers. I wonder how many more significant personalities there need to be. Now, Robert has then also gone on to say that there's many scholars in Saudi Arabia that support the terrorist attacks. Well, again, I need an objective bit of evidence. At least one name would be something that I could engage with. Now, I've given one name of a very prominent scholar who is respected worldwide by all Muslims, who publicly denounces these attacks and who also was utilised by the American president as an advisor on Islam. Could Robert give a comparable example for these terrorist-supporting Muslims that he suggests? So I guess in answer to the question overall and engaging with those points, I'd say that traditional Islam is what I guess Daniel and Robert refer to as moderate Islam. It's existed from the very beginning, it exists today, and the majority of scholars and the majority of Muslims support it. I'd say that the only reason why we're not discussing it now is because it's not very interesting generally in the media.
Okay, let's turn it over to Robert if you would like an opportunity to respond. But also, I guess I'm more concerned with not necessarily the positions on some leading Islamic scholars here in the West, because that might even just be subject to their interpretation of Islam. But more I'm concerned with, like Abdullah, you give the example of 9/11. I'm more concerned with Islam and its relation to 9/11, not a Muslim scholar's interpretation or justification or publicly condemning 9/11. Robert, did you have a response?
Oh, very much so. There's a certain amount of bait and switch going on here. I wasn't talking about terrorism. I don't have memorized everything I've said, but I don't think I even mentioned it, except in regard to the terrorist attacks, the 16,000 terrorist attacks. I was speaking about the fact that the sects and schools of Islam variously all agree in teaching warfare against unbelievers and the necessity to subjugate those unbelievers under the rule of Islamic law. That really is something that can be done with terrorism or can be done in any variety of other ways. And so if a Muslim says that he rejects terrorism, I think that's great, but there are several questions that come to mind. First thing, I want to know what he means by terrorism. For example, the Deobandi school in India, a very prominent school of Islam in India and the surrounding areas, recently, I believe it was a year or so ago, condemned terrorism, and it was international headlines and hosannas and all sorts of people getting all excited about it, until you started to read the documents which made it clear that they were condemning the terrorism that they alleged was being committed by the United States and Israel, and never mentioned anything done by Muslims in connection with terrorism at all. The same thing with the idea of Islam or Islamic scholars condemning attacks on innocent civilians. That's great, but then you have Islamic clerics in Britain and elsewhere saying there are no innocent non-Muslims because non-Muslims are in a state of rebellion against the true prophet, the Prophet Muhammad of Islam, and against the true religion, and as such there are no innocents among them. And so if you condemn attacks on innocent civilians, you're essentially saying nothing that would rebuke the jihad terrorists in the world today. The problem is much larger than that of terrorism. And then the challenge is to give an example. Sure, I can give you lots of examples of scholars who teach these kinds of things. Muhammad Salah al-Munajid out of Saudi Arabia, the scholar behind Islam Q&A online, Abu Bakr Bashir in Indonesia, many others who teach that it is part of the responsibility of Muslims to wage war against unbelievers. But I don't want to give the impression by giving you a couple of names, and I could give you many other names, that these things were invented by these people. They present themselves just as Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, did, Sayyid Qutb, the great scholar of the Muslim Brotherhood, Maulana Maududi in Pakistan, and others, great figures of the 20th century. They presented themselves as representing the true teachings of Islam. Qutb and Maududi wrote commentaries, extensive multi-volume commentaries on the Quran, which forthrightly taught based on what they understood the Quran to be saying, and based also on Islamic tradition and the mainstream ways in which the Quran had always been interpreted. They taught that it was part of the responsibility of the Muslim community worldwide to wage war against unbelievers in order to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. Not necessarily a hot war. If they could do it by stealth, if they could do it by deception, if they could do it by step-by-step ways to impose Islamic law, the way these things are going on in the West, while Islamic scholars like these two gentlemen with us tonight issue a lot of deceptions and diversions and finger-pointing about Christianity and so on, so as to confuse and befuddle people and take their attention away from how Islamic law is advancing in the West, then that would be just fine and just as good as a terrorist bombing, which does the job in another way. But the objective is the same, and that is, as Dr. Pipes was explaining, to put Muslims in a superior position in society, non-Muslims in a subservient position in society, along with women. These things are part and parcel of the mainstream teachings of Islam, always have been. And these gentlemen, you notice, they don't deny it, they just divert. They just start changing the subject and talking about something else. And so this is part of the program that I would expect they themselves also are trying to impose. But even if they aren't, they are directing their venom against us as per their ad hominem attacks earlier. And I note the apology and thank you for it. But nonetheless, the strategy in a larger sense, not just from these gentlemen, but from many other Islamic spokesmen, is to demonize the people who are non-Muslims who are calling attention to these aspects of Islam, to these teachings of Islam, and to try to fabricate the idea that it is we who are making these things up and propagating these things, and to ignore entirely the Muslims who are teaching these things in Islamic communities and stirring up Muslims worldwide to wage war in various ways against unbelievers, which is manifestly what is happening.
Robert, do you have a verse that can justify Islam calling for the subjugation of non-Muslims?
Certainly. The most notorious one is chapter 9, verse 29. Surat At-Tawbah, chapter 9 of the Quran, which in verse 29 says that Muslims should wage war against those who do not believe in Allah and His Messenger and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, which is primarily Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, the tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And that last clause about submitting and feeling themselves subdued became the cornerstone in Islamic law throughout history of an elaborate superstructure of laws that mandated that non-Muslims would indeed feel themselves subdued and be subjugated in Islamic societies, denied basic rights. These things, unfortunately, are still part of Islamic law. They can't really be changed easily. You know, I certainly would hope that there could arise new interpretations that would be generally accepted, come to be widely accepted in the Islamic world. But right now they run up against the the hard facts of what is actually in the Quran and the way these things have always been interpreted. Surah At-Tawbah, the Surah of Repentance, the 9th chapter of the Quran is generally considered to take precedence, considered by Islamic scholars, that is, mainstream Islamic scholars, to take precedence over other parts of the Quran that are generally more peaceful and teach something more akin to tolerance. And as long as that remains a mainstream view among Islamic scholars, then Muslims are going in the sense of out of a sense of piety, out of a sense of a religious responsibility, going to work to try to subjugate non-Muslims under the rule of Islamic law. And all we have to do is open our eyes and see that happening worldwide. That's not happening because of me. That's not happening because of Dr. Pipes. That's happening because of what the Quran teaches.
Okay, let's take our first call and then we'll bring it back to Imam. Mustafa, quick announcement before we take our first call. Next week, Jihad Exposed, our topic will be, is Al-Qaeda justified in Islam? Our 4 guests next week who will join us, if you remember, Omar Bakri Muhammad, as well as Anjum Chowdhury, Waleed Shubat, and Kamal Salim. So stay tuned for that. Right now, let's take our first call this evening. You're live on Jihad Exposed. Who do we have on air with us?
Hello, Summer. This is Peter calling from Germany.
Welcome, Peter. Thank you for calling.
You're welcome. It's a very interesting show. I would like to make a couple of comments, if I may.
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, beginning, the 2 Muslim gentlemen mentioned what happened by Christians, what Christians done in Bosnia, for example. But they forgot to mention that Christians also helped the Muslims there and to end this bloodshed. This is the first question, the first comment I wanted to make. And the other thing is, have you ever recognized that whatever Christian nations did in the past, there was a confession? We're still waiting for the confession of Turkey for the Armenian genocide. There's no confession from the Muslim side whatsoever. And that's why people start waking up and not believing that Islam is peace and Islam is moderate. If there's no confession about it, there will be no peace. I'm calling from Germany. We have a confession what happened 65 years ago to the Jewish people. Well, guess what? We have peace with them now. Germany is prosperous. You know, that's what I wanted to say just that, and maybe the gentleman can elaborate on that. Yes. And I wanted to thank you. I thank also ABN, Robert Spencer, and Mr. Pipes for their hard work, and you are not alone. We are behind you.
Thank you so much for calling, Peter from Germany. Let's turn it over to Dr. Pipes, who could probably elaborate a little on that for you.
So I defer.
Dr. Pipes, are you with us?
I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I was saying he wasn't asking the questions of me.
Oh, yeah.
He was supporting me, so I defer.
Oh, okay. All right, very good. Well, why don't we do this? Take a quick break, and then we will come back and continue to take your calls. If you have friends who want to watch this show live but don't have the satellite, you can refer them to abnsat.com to watch the program live. We'll be right back.
ما الصيغة التي يجب أن تعلن على الأمة كصيغة علاقة مع أمريكا ومع الغرب بشكل عام؟
تفضل.
أن نصارحهم وأن نقول
نعم.
أنتم معتدون على أرض الإسلام، تحتلون أراضينا، تستغلون ثرواتنا، تذلون شعوبنا، وإذا لم تكفوا وتعودوا وتسلموا الحقوق لأهلها فليس لنا معكم إلا صيغة واحدة، هي صيغة الجهاد، وهو الآن فرض عين على الأمة.
نعم.
دعني من بن لادن وأمثاله والقاعدة، ليس هذا هو ما أقصده بالجهاد، إنما جهاد أمة
مش جهاد أفراد
يقودها علماؤها وتعبئ الأمة بأهداف الجهاد السليمة العالية، ثم تنتهي بنا إلى مواجهة